Picture this. The year is 1518. A column of Ottoman cavalry is retreating across the sun-blasted plains outside Tlemcen, in what is now western Algeria. Behind them, a Spanish army of 10,000 men under the Marquis of Comares is closing the gap. At the center of the retreating column rides a man in his mid-40s. He has one arm. The left was blown off by a cannonball during the siege of Béjaïa 4 or 5 years ago, depending on which account you trust. His red beard, the beard that gave him his name, is streaked with dust and dried blood. He has ruled Algiers for barely 2 years. He carved it out of nothing, a pirate who made himself a sultan. Now the Spanish cavalry cuts off his rearguard. The column fragments. His bodyguard is slaughtered around him, and somewhere on that baking plain between Tlemcen and the Rio Salado, Oruç race, the original Barbarossa, is killed. His body is never recovered with certainty. The Spanish claim his head, the Ottomans claim his legend, and his younger brother Huzur, watching from a ship's deck 300 miles away in Algiers harbour, inherits everything: the fleet, the fortress, the war, and the name. Within a decade, that younger brother will become the most powerful admiral in the Mediterranean. Within 2 decades, he will humiliate the combined navies of the Holy Roman Empire, the Papal States, Venice, and Spain at the Battle of Preveza. And he will die not on the sea, but in a palace in Istanbul, as a national hero. This is not a pirate story. This is the story of 2 brothers who weaponized piracy to reshape an empire. To understand the Barbarossa brothers, you have to understand the sea they fought over. In the late 15th century, the Mediterranean was not one world, it was 2. To the east, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Bayezid II, and then Selim the Firm was expanding relentlessly. Constantinople had fallen in 1453, and Ottoman power was reaching westward across the Balkans, southward into Egypt, and along the entire North African coast. To the west, the newly unified Crown of Spain, fresh from the Reconquista of Granada in 1492, was projecting its own power into North Africa, seizing coastal strongholds at Melilla, Oran, and Béjaïa to create a buffer zone of presidios against Muslim incursion. Caught between these 2 empires were the North African port cities, Tunis, Algiers, Bougie, Djerba, governed loosely by local Hafsid and Zayanid rulers who lacked the naval power to resist either side, and roaming the sea lanes between all of them were the corsairs. This was not piracy as the Caribbean knew it a century later. Mediterranean corsairing was an institution with deep roots, sanctioned by states, regulated by custom, and driven as much by religious warfare as by profit. Muslim corsairs raided Christian shipping under the authority of North African rulers. Christian corsairs, particularly the Knights of St. John, based first on Rhodes and after 1530 on Malta, raided Muslim shipping under papal blessing. Both sides enslaved captured crews as a matter of course. The galley slave was the engine of Mediterranean naval warfare, and the line between pirate, privateer, and naval officer was functionally non-existent. The scale of this violence is hard to overstate. Modern estimates suggest that between 1500 and 1800, over 1 million Europeans were enslaved in North Africa, and a comparable number of Muslims were enslaved by Christian powers. The galley, a long, narrow warship, driven by banks of oars pulled by enslaved or conscripted rowers, was the dominant weapon system of the Mediterranean. It was fast, maneuverable, and independent of wind. It was also fueled by human suffering. A galley slave might row for years without setting foot on land. Many died at the bench. The corsairs who operated in this system were not anarchists. They were entrepreneurs of violence, embedded in networks of state patronage, religious legitimacy, and commercial exchange. A successful corsair captain needed not only seamanship and combat skill, but also the political intelligence to navigate between rival rulers, shifting alliances, and the constant risk that his patron would sell him out for a treaty. Into this world, this intersection of empires, religion, and violence, Two brothers were born on the island of Lesbos. Oruç and Hayreddin were born in Midilli, the Ottoman name for Lesbos, probably in the 1470s. Their father, Yakup Ağa, was likely a sipahi, a member of the Ottoman provincial cavalry, though some sources describe him as a potter or a converted Christian. Their mother, Katerina, was reportedly a Greek Christian, a local woman from the island. The brothers grew up bilingual, Muslim, and shaped by the sea. Lesbos was an Ottoman island, but it sat in a maritime crossroads between the Aegean, the eastern Mediterranean, and the trade routes linking Istanbul to Egypt. There were 4 brothers in all: Oruç, Hayreddin, Ishak, and Ilyas. At least 2, and possibly all 4, went to sea as young men. Ilyas, the youngest, is believed to have been killed in a naval engagement early in the brothers' career. The sources are thin on the details, and he vanishes from the record before the major events begin. Oruç, the eldest and most aggressive, became a corsair operating out of Antalya and later from the island of Djerba, off the coast of modern Tunisia. According to several Ottoman and European sources, Oruç was captured at sea by the Knights of St. John, the same military order that would later defend Malta against Suleiman, and spent 2 or 3 years as a galley slave on a Christian warship. The exact dates are disputed, but the experience was formative. When he escaped or was ransomed, accounts differ, he returned to corsairing with a ferocity that suggests the galley bench had sharpened, not broken, him. By the early 1500s, Oruç had established himself as one of the most effective corsairs in the Western Mediterranean, operating from bases in Tunis and Djerba under the loose protection of the Hafsid rulers. His ships were mostly galleys and galleots, the fast-oared warships that dominated Mediterranean combat. A standard war galley of the period was roughly 40 to 50 meters long and carried 20 to 26 rowing benches per side, each manned by 3 to 5 rowers. A galleot was smaller, lighter, and faster, typically 15 to 20 benches, and ideal for the hit-and-run tactics of corsair warfare. Both types carried lateen sails for passage-making and could be beached for careening, making them independent of permanent harbours in a way that the heavy round ships of northern European navies were not. Oruç raided Spanish, Genoese, and Papal shipping with devastating regularity. He captured merchant vessels, ransomed prisoners, and accumulated enough wealth and men to begin thinking in political rather than merely criminal terms. His crews were drawn from the polyglot world of the Mediterranean maritime underclass: Turkish sailors, Moorish refugees expelled from Spain after the Reconquista, Berber fighters from the interior, renegades, European Christians who had converted to Islam and brought their seamanship with them. The renegade population was significant. Modern historians estimate that renegades made up a substantial proportion of corsair crews and often rose to command positions. The Mediterranean was porous. Identities crossed the religious line in both directions, and skill at sea mattered more than origin. The Barbarossa brothers operated under a system of rules and alliances that would feel eerily familiar to anyone who has studied the articles of Caribbean pirate crews a century later. Crew shares, captured prizes, allegiance oaths, and the politics of corsair harbours. It was a world governed by its own brutal code. If you want to go deeper into the written and unwritten rules that governed pirate life across centuries and oceans, download the Black Flag Codex. The link is in the description, and there is a QR code on screen right now. In 1516, Oruç made the move that transformed him from corsair to ruler. The city of Algiers, a mid-sized North African port under nominal Hafsid authority, was under threat from Spanish expansion. The local ruler, weakened and unable to resist, invited Oruç to help defend the city. Oruç arrived with his fleet and his fighters. He helped, and then he took over. He deposed the local ruler, declared himself Sultan of Algiers, and began fortifying the city as his own capital. It was a classic pirate-to-king maneuver, and it worked for 2 years. The Spanish crown could not tolerate an independent corsair state on the North African coast. In 1518, a large Spanish expeditionary force under the Marquis of Comares marched on Tlemcen, where Oruç was consolidating his inland holdings. Oruç fought and lost. He was killed in battle, along with his brother Ishak. The Spanish recovered what they claimed was his body, but Hazur was still alive. The death of Oruç could have been the end of the Barbarossa story. A pirate king dead, his inland gambit crushed, his army scattered. But Hazur, who would soon take the name Hayreddin, goodness of the faith, made a decision that changed the course of Mediterranean history. Rather than try to hold Algiers alone, he pledged his allegiance directly to the Ottoman Sultan, Selim IV. This was not surrender, it was strategy. In exchange for his loyalty, Hayreddin received what no corsair had ever been given before: the official backing of the Ottoman Empire. Selim, I sent him 2,000 janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman state, along with artillery and supplies. Algiers was no longer a pirate stronghold. It was now an Ottoman province, and Hayreddin was its beylerbey, its governor-general. Over the next decade, Hayreddin consolidated Ottoman control over the central North African coast, fighting off Spanish counterattacks, subduing rival corsair captains, and building Algiers into one of the most formidable naval bases in the Mediterranean. His fleet grew from a handful of galleys to a force of dozens. His shipyards turned out purpose-built warships. His intelligence networks, sustained by ransomed captives, renegade European sailors, and a web of merchants, gave him advance warning of Spanish fleet movements. In 1533, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim's successor and the most powerful Ottoman ruler in history, summoned Hayreddin to Istanbul. The purpose was unprecedented. Suleiman wanted to rebuild the Ottoman navy from scratch, and he wanted Hayreddin to do it. Hayreddin arrived in Istanbul with a fleet of 44 galleys and galliots, a demonstration of power that reportedly stunned the capital. Suleiman appointed him Capudan Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, making a former corsair the supreme commander of one of the largest navies in the world. Hayreddin did not disappoint. He reorganized the Ottoman shipyards at Galata and along the Golden Horn, standardized galley design to improve speed and firepower, professionalized crew training, and established a system of naval conscription that drew experienced sailors from across the empire. He replaced aging vessels, introduced heavier bow-mounted cannon on his war galleys, and created a logistical infrastructure: magazines, supply depots, rope walks, timber reserves, that could sustain prolonged campaigns far from home waters. Within a year, he had a fleet capable of challenging any Christian navy in the Mediterranean. His first major campaign, as Capudan Pasha, was a devastating raid on the Italian coast in 1534, striking at Reggio Calabria, the coast of Campania, and towns belonging to the Kingdom of Naples and the Papal States, a direct message to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V that Ottoman naval power could reach the heart of Christendom. The raids were calculated. Hayreddin targeted wealthy coastal towns for ransom and slaves, but also for political effect. Every burning watchtower along the Italian coast was a reminder that the Mediterranean was no longer a Christian lake. Charles V responded with the weapon he knew best: a coalition. In 1535, he assembled a massive combined fleet, Spanish, Genoese, Papal, and Maltese, under the command of the Genoese Admiral Andrea Doria, and launched an expedition against Tunis. The expedition succeeded in taking the city and liberating an estimated 20,000 Christian captives from the corsair slave pens. But Hayreddin escaped with much of his fleet intact. The victory at Tunis was real, but it was not decisive. The decisive battle came 3 years later. On September 28, 1538, at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf on the western coast of Greece, Hayreddin Barbarossa met the combined Christian fleet at the Battle of Preveza. Andrea Doria commanded an allied force of roughly 300 ships, galleys, sailing vessels and transports, assembled from Spain, Venice, the Papal States, Genoa, and the Knights of Malta. Hayreddin had approximately 122 galleys, smaller in number, but manned by experienced crews and operating on interior lines. The battle itself was shaped as much by weather, indecision and personality as by tactics. The Allied fleet had a significant advantage in numbers and firepower, particularly in its large Venetian galleons and round ships, which carried heavier cannon than any galley. But round ships depended on wind, and on September 28th, the wind was fickle. Andrea Doria, cautious by nature and deeply protective of his own Genoese squadron, hesitated to commit his heavy ships into action. Whether this was prudence, cowardice, or a calculated decision to preserve Genoese interests at the expense of the alliance remains one of the most debated questions in Mediterranean naval history. Hayreddin exploited this hesitation ruthlessly. He concentrated his faster galleys against the Venetian wing of the Allied fleet, the only contingent willing to close and fight, and savaged it while Doria's Genoese and Spanish squadrons watched from the periphery. The Venetian commander Vincenzo Capello fought hard, but was overwhelmed by superior numbers at the point of contact. By the end of the day, the Allied fleet had lost at least a dozen galleys captured and several more sunk, along with hundreds of prisoners and significant quantities of arms and supplies. The remainder of the coalition withdrew without achieving its objective. Hayreddin held the field, and more importantly, he held the initiative. Preveza was not a bloodbath on the scale of Lepanto in 1571, but its strategic consequences were enormous. It confirmed Ottoman naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean for a generation. It exposed the chronic inability of the Christian powers to cooperate effectively at sea, and it made Hayreddin Barbarossa one of the most celebrated military commanders in Ottoman history, a former pirate who had defeated the combined navies of Europe. From the articles of Caribbean buccaneers to the raiding codes of Ottoman corsairs, pirate law evolved in parallel across centuries and seas. The Black Flag Codex traces those parallels, how men who lived outside the law created laws of their own. Download it from the link in the description. After Preveza, Hayreddin continued to operate as Capodan Pasha, conducting raids on the Italian coast, negotiating with and against the French, and managing the complex politics of Ottoman North Africa. His reputation after the battle was such that Charles V reportedly attempted to hire Hayreddin away from the Ottoman court with an offer of the governorship of North Africa under Spanish sovereignty. Hayreddin declined, or so the Ottoman sources claim. The offer, if it was real, tells you how the Christian powers viewed him, not as a pirate to be hanged, but as a strategic asset to be purchased. In 1543, he cooperated with the French King Francis I in a joint campaign against Nice, one of the most improbable alliances in Mediterranean history. Francis, locked in his endless rivalry with Charles V, invited the Ottoman fleet to operate alongside the French navy against their common Habsburg enemy. Hayreddin besieged Nice, failed to take the citadel, and then wintered his entire fleet, an estimated 30,000 men, in the French port of Toulon. The French actually evacuated the civilian population to make room. For 6 months, Ottoman galleys sat in a Christian harbour. Ottoman sailors prayed in converted churches, and French and Ottoman officers shared meals and intelligence. The alliance scandalized Christendom and accomplished relatively little strategically, but it demonstrated the degree to which the old pirate had become a player on the highest level of European power politics. Hayreddin Barbarossa died on July 4, 1546, in his palace in Istanbul. He was approximately 70 years old. He was buried in a turba, a mausoleum, at Beşiktaş, overlooking the Bosphorus, where the strait meets the Sea of Marmara. Ottoman sailors reportedly saluted his tomb when passing by sea for centuries afterward. He did not die on the quarterdeck. He did not die in chains. He died a statesman, wealthy, honoured, and old, the rarest fate for any man who began his career as a pirate. The name Barbarossa itself is the first myth to unpack. It comes from the Italian Barbarossa, Redbeard, and was originally applied to Oruç, who reportedly had a striking red or reddish auburn beard. After Oruç's death, the name transferred to Hayreddin, even though his own beard was reportedly darker. European sources from the 16th century onward used Barbarossa almost interchangeably for both brothers, creating a composite monster, a single, immortal pirate terrorizing the Mediterranean for decades. Ottoman sources tell a different story. In the Turkish historiographical tradition, the brothers are usually referred to separately, Oruç and Hayreddin Pasha, and treated not as pirates but as ghazis, warriors of the faith and servants of the Ottoman state. The distinction matters. To Europe, Barbarossa was a pirate. To the Ottoman Empire, he was an admiral. Both descriptions are accurate. Neither is complete. The sources themselves are problematic. The most detailed early account of the Barbarossa brothers comes from the Gazavata Hayreddin Pasha, a narrative attributed to Hayreddin himself, purportedly dictated to his secretary Sinan Savuş, and sometimes called the Barbarossa Memoir. Modern historians, including Andrew Hess and Svat Sausek, have debated its authorship, dating, and reliability. It is a valuable source, but it is also a self-serving one, written to glorify its subject and align his career with Ottoman imperial interests. European accounts, drawn largely from captured sailors, diplomatic correspondence, and published chronicles like Paolo Giovio's Historiarum Sui Temporis, have their own biases, presenting Barbarossa as a monster and a slave trader, which he certainly was, while ignoring the equivalent practices of Christian corsairs and the Knights of St. John. The galley slave question is particularly instructive. Modern popular accounts often present the enslavement of Oruç by the knights as a foundational trauma, a captivity narrative that explains his later ferocity. The historical record supports the captivity, but not the simplistic revenge arc. Oruç was a corsair before his capture. He was a corsair after it. Galley slavery was the common fate of any sailor captured in the Mediterranean. The Christians enslaved Muslims. The Muslims enslaved Christians. The moral weight was symmetrical, and treating Oruç's captivity as uniquely radicalizing misreads the violence of the era. Similarly, the fall of Algiers to Oruç in 1516 is sometimes presented in popular accounts as a liberation, a Muslim hero freeing a Muslim city from Christian threat. The reality is murkier. Oruç was invited by the local ruler. He then murdered or deposed that ruler. His takeover was a coup, not a liberation, and the local population's response was mixed at best. The Barbarossa legend has had a long and uneven afterlife in popular culture, though far less visible in the Anglophone world than the pirates of the Caribbean. In Turkey, Hayreddin Barbarossa remains a national naval hero. The Turkish Navy names vessels after him. His turba at Beşiktaş is a pilgrimage site, and every year the Turkish Navy commemorates his legacy with formal ceremonies. The 2013 Turkish television series Barbaros Hayreddin and its successors dramatized his life for mass audiences, blending historical narrative with nationalist myth-making in ways that parallel Hollywood's treatment of Caribbean pirates. In European popular culture, Barbarossa appears sporadically, usually as a villain. The name surfaces in films, novels, and video games, often stripped of its Ottoman context and reduced to a generic pirate menace. In the Assassin's Creed franchise, Barbarossa-era Mediterranean piracy provides setting material, though the games take significant liberties with chronology and character. In the 1951 film The Pirates of Tripoli, the Barbarossa story is loosely adapted into a swashbuckler that tells us far more about 1950s Hollywood than about 16th century North Africa. Perhaps the most interesting cultural parallel is one the brothers would never have known about. The name Barbarossa was later borrowed by the German Emperor Frederick V, Frederick Barbarossa, though the connection is etymological, not historical. And in 1941, Adolf Hitler named the German invasion of the Soviet Union Operation Barbarossa, consciously invoking the medieval emperor, but unconsciously echoing the corsair, a conqueror who overreached and whose empire did not survive intact. What the Barbarossa brothers built was not a pirate kingdom. It was something more consequential and more uncomfortable, proof that piracy, scaled and professionalized, could become statecraft. Oruç took a fleet and turned it into a territory. Hayreddin took that territory and turned it into a province of the most powerful empire on earth. Between them, they demonstrated that the line between piracy and sovereignty is not a matter of morality, it is a matter of scale. A man who robs a ship is a pirate. A man who robs a coastline and then governs it is a king. A man who does both and then pledges his fleet to an emperor becomes an admiral. The Mediterranean they fought over is still contested water. The same strait that Hayreddin's galleys patrolled between North Africa and southern Europe remains one of the most politically charged stretches of ocean in the world. The dynamics have changed, but the geography has not. And the fundamental question the Barbarossa brothers embodied, who controls the sea and what gives them the right, has never been answered. Consider the trajectory. In 1500, two brothers from a small Aegean island are raiding merchant ships for profit. By 1520, one of them has died trying to hold a kingdom. By 1540, the other commands the largest navy in the Mediterranean and dines with the representatives of the King of France. The distance between those two endpoints is not measured in miles or years. It is measured in the willingness of empires to absorb their own enemies when those enemies prove useful. The Ottoman Empire did not hire Hayreddin because he was good. It hired him because he was dangerous, and it is always cheaper to employ the dangerous than to fight them. That calculation, that piracy, at sufficient scale, becomes too expensive to suppress and too valuable to ignore, is the oldest lesson of naval warfare, and the Barbarossa brothers taught it more completely than anyone before or since. Oruç died on a dusty plain, one-armed, surrounded, his kingdom less than 2 years old. Hayreddin died in a palace overlooking the Bosphorus, old and rich and honoured, his tomb saluted by passing ships. One brother got the death a pirate earns, the other got the death an empire grants. Together, they got the name Barbarossa that outlived them both. The Bosphorus at dusk. That particular colour the water turns, not blue, not grey, but something older than either. When the light drops behind the hills of Thrace and the Aegean shore goes gold. Somewhere beneath the surface of that strait, the currents still run the way they ran when Hayreddin's galleys pulled through them. South from the Black Sea, north from the Marmara, crossing and tangling in the deep channel the way empires crossed and tangled above. The fishermen on the Galata bridge still cast their lines into water that carried the keels of corsair fleets. At Besiktas, the turbie still stands. The marble is weathered now. The inscriptions are faded. But the tomb faces the sea, the way it always has, as if the old admiral is still watching the strait, still waiting for the signal fire on the Aegean shore that means a fleet is coming home. The Mediterranean remembers nothing. It takes the keels and the blood and the cannon smoke and smooths them into blue silence. It does not care who won at Preveza, or who died at Tlemcen, or who built the shipyards at Galata. It only moves, tide after tide, century after century. The way it moved when two brothers from Lesbos looked at it and saw not water but a road. The wind shifts. The current turns. The strait goes dark. And the name, Barbarossa, passes over the water like a rumour that never quite becomes a fact.